So a lot's changed in the last 6 years that I've been working in supply due diligence. I've been witness to varying approaches, wildly varying approaches from organisations quite similar, all trying to do reasonably similar things around risk and compliance. What has become more consistent, I think, in the last couple of years has been CPOs delivering transformational projects aimed at being more consistent and systematic in the way that organisations approach risk. I think that's influenced in a number of areas, but one by the increasing rhetoric we hear about from the board about doing the right thing, about companies not solely focusing on maximising profit, but being focused on managing reputation in equal measure. I think that in turn is putting an increasing stress on the traditional functions of supply chain and the procurement. So what I want to do in the next 25 minutes is to explore those issues through the means of a couple of case studies and really kind of plant some seeds, get some thoughts going around what you think your role is within this process and your own personal readiness and the readiness of your organisation to address these challenges. So overview is going to be 3 of the emerging trends that we just touched upon. The core will be 2 case studies of experience of delivering particular projects in this area, and like I say, we'll focus on some takeaways in terms of data and visualization tools. But first, a quick question for you all in this room. So I did this talk at Procurement Summit a couple of weeks back, and I've just changed the top there to what you think the CPO should contribute rather than procurement. Broad level room here of people who are in roles of CPOs or aspiring to be CPOs. I really want to start with an open question. I've got 4 options there, which I'll go through. There was an all of the above option, but I took it out because it's always too easy to have one of those. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but really this is to start with thinking about what you feel, what you think the role of the CPO should be in terms of supplier due diligence. So should that role focus on establishing supplier due diligence policy and frameworks? Should it be more to do with building working groups to create policy and frameworks? Should it be feeding specific requirements into established policies and frameworks, or more akin to managing supplier relationships against existing policy and frameworks? So, like I say, there is an all of the above option that I took off. But it'd be interesting to start to get any initial thoughts, any initial discussion points from this. Like I say, I usually do this to a room of people who are less well qualified than you guys to talk about this. So it might be interesting if anyone has any initial contribution they'd like to make, where they feel that you spend most of your time, or where you feel that the most value is to be had in terms of establishing and contributing towards the due diligence piece. Or is it too early? You're my ideas first.
If anyone's done their SIPS ethical training, they should be able to answer this question.
I think it's a challenge because it's not a one-size-fits-all, and a lot of it is all of the above, or it's leading the group but taking people with you. It's a combination of these factors. A show of hands in Manchester were limited, but actually each one had a few people showing hands at different points. I think this is the challenge really for you as a group, is that it can be very multi-dimensional depending on what type of organisation you work for, what industry you're in, what legacy systems you've got, what access to information you have or haven't got. It's difficult for people like me because obviously how do we approach an organisation to achieve this sort of consistent approach that you all want to approaching risk? You all want to do some level of due diligence, and that's because doing the right thing is now intrinsically linked to being a good business. So yeah, we'll come on to that. We'll come back to that. Maybe I'll force you to answer a bit later on. So what are the key issues you're facing, or the key issues as we see them? The first one is the broad area of ethical procurement. So I'm not going to go through everything that we have in the next 20 minutes, but a couple of key kind of headlines. So the Modern Slavery Bill was 2015 in March. The impact of that on the supply chain I'll touch on in a second, but 12 million people in forced labour, that's about a third of the population of the UK. A survey by Ethical Corporation of CPOs, 50%, the highest number of respondents, said that human rights was the number one issue they saw coming in the next 12 months. So Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, I'm sure you know about it, but it's companies of above a certain size producing a statement on the website to say there is no modern slavery in their supply chain. That's kind of the starter. It's in a kind of beta phase if you think about it when you drill into what that actually means. This was the first case that was brought in June this year. One of the companies involved in this were the Happy Egg Company. So they were you couldn't script it. So these guys had factories in Kent. There was Lithuanian workers being trafficked into their factories, so not great for their brand. Anti-bribery and corruption. So you've probably all done bribery training at certain points. Probably time to revisit that because the UK are talking about, this is the Attorney General from September, the liability upon managers, essentially, for bribery in your business. So as a CPO, bribery in your supply chain or bribery on buyers, certainly looking to place a high liability on you as a manager in terms of the potential to be prosecuted because of failure of staff to prevent fraud. Driven by the UK Bribery Act, I'm sure you've exposed to that, which was driven in turn by the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that forerun that. And some pretty chunky fines, Glaxo fine a couple of years ago for doing things in China with their third parties, of which suppliers are some. The second issue in that is the kind of abstract stuff you might have thought about when you see this Panama Papers piece, right? This is about companies who we don't know who owns them rather. This quote from Simon Walker, the UK Institute of Directors, basically anonymous companies. This was 312,000 businesses who were created in parts of the world where it's difficult to get information because of the fact that it's difficult to get information, to obfuscate who owns them for tax reasons, but for reasons around other things. And tax evasion is now kind of linked to offences around money laundering, all of that back onto the supply chain. So again, knowing who you're dealing with fundamentally. The beneficial ownership, beneficial owners are, we think of them as puppet masters. They're these 10 people who control lots of companies. And I've got an example later on of one of you guys here, actually, your company. In fact, they've left. The guy from Heathrow, which I'll touch upon to see how his company rolls up to a high-profile individual. Come back to that one. And so what's happening in the UK, there's a new register of what we call persons of significant control. These are people who own 25% of a company. So the UK has reacted to the Panama Papers piece and across Europe to try and get more transparency on companies. The third issue, I put this together actually before the US election when this was a headline. But yeah, obviously I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the macroeconomics around Brexit and around Trump, but it's volatility, isn't it? It's uncertainty. Investment in capex projects, investment in long-term projects is clearly challenging. What it means for the supply chain, this is an article from our blog which talks about people thinking of opening up new supply chains in other parts of the world beyond Europe. So moving into emerging markets, Asia, Africa, fine, fantastic. What about all this stuff? So a lot going on. So two contrasting approaches to due diligence. These are real examples. They're not held up here as being perfect examples of how to do this. I think there is, no perfect example in life. The first one in particular is more about a series of tactical steps that someone had to take and not necessarily come to a consistent approach. The second example is more of a consistent approach. So we'll see as you go through them some examples of ideas and things that might resonate. So the first one, we're going solo. I say we, you. Procurement went on their own and did something. So this is a large organisation. They're a retailer, turnover 2 billion, have an emerging market supply chain, have low-cost supply chain because they're in retail where margins are clearly very tight. There was a specific business challenge here it's worth just touching on. So this organisation had to go through, as you all have to do, renewal of your banking relationships managed by the Treasury team. These happen every sort of 4 to 5 years. And what happened was the Treasury team were told by the banks, you need to do screening on all your suppliers for sanctions. Seems a bit abstract, so we'll touch on that in a second. Not just the top tier or the top whatever it is, all 6,500 of those suppliers need to be screened against sanction lists, which turned the company into a bit of a spin because there was quite a short turnaround time against this because the renewal of the banking agreements were due. Just to touch on sanctions, what are they? There are restrictions on dealing with entities, so suppliers. We're seeing an increasing focus on the supply chain of banks being more concerned about where the money is going, who you're paying out to. that flow of capital into suppliers. Again, just the fines are always there, $223 million, $32 million from an oil company working in Iran. And it's not just dealing with countries, it's state-owned entities. So people like Heathrow have connections to Singapore, which we'll see. So again, these can cause real concern for the lenders out there funding. These are deliberately blocks. They're not linked together. They should probably be closer together. This was the main challenge in the project, was deciding who to do what. So we had 4 stakeholders. We had the procurement team because of the supplier relationships. We had the legal team because of the sort of legal dynamics here. We had Treasury because Treasury managed the banks. And we had human resources because high-profile employees were actually subject to this kind of vetting already. As an interesting side note, the head of procurement is married to the head of legal in this organisation. So I'm not sure what that says about project leadership and collaboration, but there certainly was a bit of a standoff on the project, I hasten to add. But yeah, it's a real challenge. We had teams of people in rooms, and there was a kind of, okay, who does what, who blinks. But clearly, procurement, being procurement, got it done, let's get it done, let's get out there and let's try and do something. So what do? They did 3 things, 3 sort of, like I say, quite short-termist, tactical things that needed doing. Ultimately, they didn't necessarily get to the end goal, as we'll see, but each of these projects is worth exploring, just as because there's merit in what they did. So the first one was about quality of data. We're a data company. We find neglected data everywhere. And this just walks through pretty typical processes to go through to improve that data. So stage 1, consolidating internal Excel, ERP sheets. Stage 2, linking to spend analytics company. And stage 3, enriching it with a company of our type to do that. So quite an important process. Again, the context was this was quite a tactical piece of work that should be done as a continuous piece of work. Hence, there was challenges in delivering. I did mention before that all their suppliers were in scope. Yes. They decided upon themselves as procurement actually to do a bit of a segmentation piece to find out which of their high-risk suppliers, because if those high-risk suppliers had sanctions, the reputational impact, the business continuity impacts would be high. But again, this wasn't something that was a recurring process. Perhaps it should have been. This was very much a short-term, let's have a quick look at our strategic suppliers, the ones that spend more than $1 million, what have you. So again, some challenges around that. And one of the outputs of this project, so when you come to these kind of things around sanctions and around risk, applying a model to anything, having a consistent model of what good and bad looks like is very important. So financial health, D&B score, whatever, what's the consistent approach? Is a B good and a C good, or a D, whatever? So some consistency around the approach to this was needed around the outputs of the risk and the sanction screening. Procurement didn't really get the support they needed, I don't think, on this particular project. And that's where I guess they were quite far stretched out from their comfort zone in terms of, okay, do we screen the company? Do we screen the company's parents, as in the owners of the company? Do we screen the individual beneficial owners of the company, the directors? So again, some challenges around the delivery of the solution when it comes to producing a risk model. So the outcome's worth sort of flagging. We managed to get a lot of the suppliers through the initial spectrum of this. We got to a point where we identified some red flags. But as I've sort of hinted at, momentum was a little bit lost in the project. So what was the role of procurement? Okay, so they were running 3 tactical projects at once. They were running independently of the business, delivering. Because of that fact, they were left alone a little bit to deliver a risk model for supplier screening, and had the challenges of balancing what I would describe as typical commercial relationships with their newly legal compliance relationships. Because of that, we learned some lessons. They learned some lessons. I think the first one is to build some connectivity back into the sourcing process. So actually start by doing this up front, early on. Focus on what happens next. So it's all well and good doing this once, but it's a recurring process and requires you to think about monitoring on an ongoing basis. And the third one, interpersonally, relationships, collaboration, working groups are not easy to create, even if you're married. Even more so. So that's the first one to reflect on and come back to. So case study 2, we are better together. This organisation is a pharmaceutical company, turnover about 16 billion, highly regulated. If those of you working in pharma, so there's lots of thresholds for supply, cost of change, agility is quite difficult, I think, in those environments because the amount of regs. And they had an integrated global supply chain, so there was already lots of integration of systems and technology. And what was their business challenge? So the background to this, a bit more high level than before. So there was a number of, and have been and ongoing, a number of high profile bribery and corruption related scandals. We touched on a couple earlier. Many of those involving, as we'll come on to, third parties, and those third parties, some of them are suppliers. Now, they had a process that we'll touch upon. The auditors could come in and audited the process and spotted some gaps, and specific gaps around knowing who these suppliers were owned by. So we'll come on to that again, but they had some gaps in the current process. And their supply chain was significant, so a global supply chain of about 15,000 organisations. The first thing that was different was this project was sold internally differently. From day one, this was a third-party risk management project. This wasn't just about suppliers, although, as you know, the complexity there in the supply chain. This was about everything. This was about the distribution arm, logistics, delivery, which may be considered to be suppliers, but are slightly different in the way they manage the supply chain. Agents, so people selling on their behalf, very high risk. Partners, so people acting on them and also potential joint ventures. And also the customers. So the whole piece was looked at in collaboration from the outset. And it wasn't just procurement, so it was a diverse group of orange men, but a diverse section of Lego characters. In fact, we touched on this earlier about the finance and technology piece and how that interrelationship, having that consistency across the piece, and just from budget perspective is so crucial. So a diverse project group had been assembled, and it had SMEs, subject matter experts from compliance, from legal, areas like trade sanctions. So if you sell goods and services abroad already into those parts of the world, you'll be doing some kind of risk assessment on your customers. This is on the suppliers, so it makes sense to bring them in. So the first thing they did, this was the process we inherited when we sort of started working with them and are still working with them, was to design this process. And so the role of procurement we'll come on to is the architect of the process. Establishing a consistent source to pay, establishing SRM is not something that happens overnight, but that establishing that process, and then building in some connectivity at the front end of that process and at the back end of that process to an external provider of due diligence. So early on, you could filter. This looks like a questionnaire, about 28 questions that then decides the scope of due diligence. So if the questionnaire says there's various things that are high risk, you should therefore do a deeper assessment depending on the outcome of the questionnaire. And that's filled in by the business at the front end, and procurement or compliance and process come involved here. Anything that spits out from the process of working with us that's even higher risk gets the external auditors or the boots on the ground or some kind of on-site audit. And that's then linked back into SRM in terms of what's happening to your particular suppliers in terms of relationship management. So, you know, you're all nodding, I can see some nods in the room. That designing of that end-to-end process, without that, we're sort of chasing our tail. We're doing 3 or 4 tactical things at once. Where we are today is, this is going to be a bit of a plug for us, but we're actually hoping to automate more of that upfront stuff. So access to greater information early on means you've not got to ask people who your director is in your questionnaire if you access the information, who owns you. We'll come on to that in a second. It's information that we can automate. So hopefully shortening that gap and less questionnaires or fewer questionnaires and shorter questionnaires. We hate questionnaires. So there you go. What's the role of procurement? Is designing the process. It's engaging subject matter experts, and it's helping to achieve or pushing for automation where possible. The outcome of the business, a couple of things. This process or this thing from compliance, the term fail fast. If you're going to fail fast. If suppliers aren't going to be onboarded, if they don't stack up, let's know quickly. Let's help the business not to go into those relationships and spend time negotiating commercial contracts with things that are never going to pass compliance or pass legal or pass finance. They've increased their total coverage of their third parties. Earlier you talked about how, as I was told, we want fewer suppliers, rationalisation, and I guess some of that earlier talk about agility means maybe there's more suppliers floating around. So the need to increase coverage on that quickly from my tier 1s, my strategics to my tier 2s, and now all 15,000 potentially in scope. And there's less reliance placed on questionnaires. There's still a necessary evil, but there's less reliance on the answers. Obvious stuff, senior sponsorship is important, upfront saves time, industry standards are consistently rising. So a couple of points. I'm always there, and we have a discussion. This is what we do. We unravel the corporate world. So we help people take a broad range of information and deliver that in a simple view. And that's a broad range of information that's growing exponentially daily, the amount of information being created by our partners. To illustrate that, this is a bit of a stitch-up actually. The guy Chris Hughes, who was from Heathrow, I think he had to leave, and he was down here doing his slides. So whilst he was doing his slides, I looked at his company to try and pull out how that looks in reality around Heathrow Airport. So it's quite an interesting example. Heathrow, of course, being a very associated to British Airways, sort of British company. We've got Heathrow here. This is Heathrow Airport. But if we trace them up, we've actually got 5% or 5.5% by the government of Singapore. So Singaporean government and the Singaporean Ministry of Finance have a tiny stake in the business through the seed fund into there. And then quite interestingly, Ferrovial, who are a big multinational Spanish oil mining industrial, a chap called Rafael de Pino Calvel Sotelo has 11% effectively in Heathrow through that relationship. And that's the information that we can access in a single click in our reports. So it seems okay, but actually, Singaporean government, if that was the North Korean government, might not be as simple, and I don't know how Singapore are behaving at the moment, and if it was Hong Kong, if it was China, that's probably the first concern. And he actually is, I think he's a pretty nice guy. You read his Forbes profile, but if he wasn't, and if he was recruited for someone, if he was working for someone else or had a relationship, I'm not going to go into it, but you can imagine there's the potential for that to cause concern. We can deliver sort of dashboards. It's not very clear, but you can take data and produce scorecards and risk assessment and have things like size and age of business, date of incorporation. So a company by its nature, we talked about these startups. So how do you look at these companies and assess risk? Companies more than 3 years old, is it likely to fail? In certain industries, potentially, but in certain industries not. So looking at that, looking at sectors, looking at country risk, and financial strength, and producing a pretty simple but fairly easy to use and early on the process scorecard of what's going to pass, what's going to fail. A plug for a partner. These guys are called RepRisk. Worth looking at them. Been around for a long time. Quite heavy involved in work in the Nordics. They produce market reports. Reputational risk is their business. They talk about ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. And this is about forced labour in the supply chain. This is a report into the Thai food industry. No surprise, there are some concerns around that. So these are the kind of data that we can bring into our reports. So that's it really for me. 3 takeaways. Suppliers are about more than supply these days. I think we'll talk about it in a second, but be ready to answer that question. What are we doing about this in the hallway when you get knocked by the CFO, CEO? What are we doing about due diligence? And I think the only approach really is to be joined up. So that's it from me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all. If you'd like to have a bit of discussion, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts and how you feel that you should approach due diligence as a CPO.